please try to find a seat? We're about to get started. Well, good afternoon. I'm Liz Cole, and I was SPSSI president in 2018 to 2019. And I have the honor today to welcome you to this year's presidential keynote and to introduce our speaker. I met Dr. President Grzanka at the 4th Annual Critical Race Studies Symposium at UCLA in 2010, when he had not yet taken a tenure-track position. He emailed me out of the blue, and he asked for a meeting, and I still remember our conversation sitting on a bench outside in LA, and as we talked, I thought, who is this young white guy who is so interested and so knowledgeable about intersectionality? Little did I know how that was going to go. Since that time, he's become my colleague and my dear friend, and it's my pleasure to introduce him today. Dr. Grzanka is Divisional Dean for Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as Professor of Psychology and affiliate faculty in both Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and in Counseling Psychology at the University of Tennessee, where he has worked since 2014. He earned his doctorate and his undergraduate degree at the University of Maryland. He's a fellow of APA as well as of Division 17, Counseling Psych, Division 35, Psych of Women, Division 44, Society for the Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, and of course, our own Division 9, SPSSI. He has served as an associate editor of the Journal of Counseling Psychology, and he's a member of many editorial boards, including for the American Sociological Review, which, if you don't know, is basically the JPSB of sociology. I say that because it gives you a sense of both the breadth and the quality of his work. Patrick is a deeply publicly engaged scholar. He's worked extensively with Planned Parenthood in Tennessee, including a 6-year term as chairman of the board of directors for Tennessee Advocates for Planned Parenthood. And he has a long record of publishing op-eds in outlets that include the Washington Post. And very fittingly, he recently co-edited a special issue of American Psychologist about publicly engaged psychology. Just as fittingly, Patrick has been the recipient of many awards, including the Distinguished Contribution to Public Policy Award given by Division 44, the Michelle Alexander Early Career Award given by Division 9, and teaching awards from both Division 35 and SPSSI, as well as many recognitions from his home institutions. Dr. Grzanka has a long list of publications in the areas of science and technology studies, gender and sexuality studies, critical whiteness studies, and last but not least, intersectionality. As a scholar, he's a sophisticated critical theorist while also maintaining a program of multi-method empirical work with a policy focus. Patrick has made foundational contributions to advance our discipline's understanding of intersectionality, including his edited book, which has been through multiple editions. He's also published a body of his own scholarship in the area, contributions that brilliantly address its application to research, pedagogy, and activism. His work honors and clarifies the foundational theory in this area, and it also creates opportunities for others to participate in the conversation, notably such as his mentorship of student authors when he edited the APA journal Translational Issues in Psychological Science. In a second line of research, he addresses the implications of the belief that sexual orientation is innate. The idea that people are, quote unquote, born this way can be two-edged, both naturalizing minority sexual orientations and essentializing them as others. In his empirical work, Grzanka and his co-authors address this phenomenon from many angles, as an ideology that they can assess through surveys, as a dogma that circulates among elites and that can be assessed through policy analysis, and as a system of scientific beliefs that can be discerned through discourse analysis of interviews with scientists. He's currently at work on a monograph that traces the ways these beliefs have unfolded and gained cultural power over time. His arguments informed by interviews with leading scholars who have shaped the conversation in this area. This line of work challenges what people think they know, and it's aimed towards changing attitudes and policy. Patrick's work is creative, bold, and important. Invariably, it's not only interdisciplinary, but it's also politically, historically, and theoretically contextualized. Patrick uses this breadth as a tool to stretch and even break past the boundaries of social psychology in order to better represent the experiences of groups that are minoritized, erased, and at risk. It's as if he's asking the discipline to be better and telling us he knows we can be and setting an example for us to follow. I've been looking forward to this talk since he was elected. I know it's going to be great. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Patrick Grzanka for his presidential keynote address.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was too generous, and you also reminded me that I have an overdue review for ASR. Just a quick housekeeping note before we begin. Please join me for a reception immediately after this session, right outside those doors. And for those of you who are interested, and I hope many of you are, starting at 6:15, all of the editors of the SPSSI journals, as well as the chairs of the publications committee, are going to be in the Reynolds room, and invite all of you to come and talk to them about publishing your work in SPSSI journals, as well as our book series edited by Brian Christian. I want to begin by acknowledging that I was born and raised about an hour south of here in the traditional homelands of the Susquehannocks, the Shawnee, and the Lenape Native American tribes, whose land was stolen to create the city we are now convening in to discuss the future of social justice in psychology and society. I'm also speaking to you in a time of war that feels unspeakable, but that we must speak about, as so many of you are bravely doing at this conference and in your lives. In response to the horrific attack on October 7th, 2023 by Hamas on primarily Israeli civilians, more than 37,000 Palestinian people have been killed in Gaza, and hundreds of thousands have been starved, displaced, detained, or assaulted by Israeli forces using weapons procured through allies, including the United States. Though news coverage has focused on the gender and age of those killed, as though some lives are more fundamentally valuable or some deaths are worth mourning more than others, I want to acknowledge all of these deaths and the destruction of Gaza as one of the greatest violations of human rights of our time, and one of the greatest policy failures in human history that we as a global community have allowed this to happen. I also want to thank the many brilliant and compassionate people, including many in this room, who have worked with me this past year and taught me so much about the history and present of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, and for demonstrating tremendous compassion in a time where there sometimes seems to be a stark deficit of human empathy in our world. As custodians of the psychology of social issues and problems, it's not just a methodological, ethical, or practical imperative for us to carefully examine the systems and institutions that structure our society in order to do our work. It's practically axiomatic. We cannot do the psychology of social issues without meeting the moment, so to speak. It's not that I think ours is the only or even best way to study social problems in all instances, but it is unquestionably the one that I care the most about. The SPSSI way is the one that inspired me as a graduate student to not give up on psychology in exchange for more critical or less conservative fields. SPSSI scholars are the ones who gave me the confidence to believe I could find a place in academia that might be receptive to the kinds of questions I had to ask and the methods I was most excited to use. And most importantly, scholars working in the SPSSI tradition, many of whom are in this room tonight, taught and inspired me to imagine a critical psychology that would invite and cultivate rather than marginalize and exclude careful and ambitious explorations of the most pressing and complex social problems of our time. But the fascists have been busy and we have a lot to cover, so let's get to it. First, despite the interconnected and intertwined nature of political violence against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, immigrants, LGBT people, non-Christians, women, and all pregnancy-capable people in the US, much of popular or mainstream framing of these issues happens in single-axis terms that obscure the intersectional nature of structural violence and refuse to name them as tools of fascism. Let's take a closer look. Political attacks, including specific laws prohibiting the teaching of critical race theory, largely in public elementary and high schools, as well as undergraduate classrooms and other places CRT is not being taught, became pervasive throughout the country, including in Democratic voting jurisdictions after the 2020 uprisings in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder by Derek Chauvin. CRT became the target of far-right activist Christopher Rufo, who is credited with starting the conservative backlash against CRT with a September 1st, 2020 appearance on Tucker Carlson Tonight. According to the New Republic, after appearing in no more than 10 US news stories per month between January 2016 and September 2020, CRT appeared in 25,000 news stories between September 2020 and January 2023. Rufo is quoted in The New Yorker as identifying CRT as the perfect villain in the conservative movement against progressive values, particularly in education. Rufo has fixated on how liberals and progressives are allegedly indoctrinating young people into the ideology of cultural Marxism. The anti-CRT wave was certainly motivated by anti-Black racism. However, it is interesting, if unsurprising, to see how media framing of the anti-CRT movement largely neglects to account for how Rufo and his colleagues' explicit and consistent connection of CRT to anti-capitalist, feminist, queer, and trans critical theories. For example, in spring 2022, the College Board, the not-for-profit company that controls the SAT, GRE, and the Advanced Placement or AP curriculum, released the proposed curriculum for a new course in African American Studies. Though to some audiences the curriculum was fairly milquetoast and completely appropriate for advanced high school students, controversy around the curriculum erupted almost immediately and intensified when GOP presidential hopeful Ron DeSantis criticized the course and suggested that he would not allow it to be taught in Florida schools. Throughout the year, right-wing fear-mongering around the course circulated in the news, with media outlets concentrating coverage on objections to terms such as systemic, which had become a flashpoint during the ongoing anti-CRT wars. When the College Board released revisions to the curriculum in February 2023, it appeared that references to some of Rufo, DeSantis, and allies' favorite targets had been eliminated from the curriculum. A closer examination of the omissions in the College Board's politicized revision offers insight into the logic of censorship and repression engineered by Rufo to squash resistance to the far-right's agenda. According to a comprehensive analysis conducted by the Washington Post, in terms of number of deletions, no single word was more scrubbed from the proposed AP curriculum than intersectionality, which went from 19 instances in the original to 1 in the 2023 revision. The next greatest reduction came from the word womanism, which went from 14 in 2022 to 0 in the 2023 version. Intersections went from 8 to 1. The Black feminist founded and directed Movement for Black Lives went from 6 to 0, as did the originator of intersectionality studies, Kimberly Crenshaw, who went from 5 mentions to 0 in the revision. Queer remained completely absent in both documents, though gay curiously increased from 0 to 2, as did Colin Powell. Absent in the original. I told you we were going to talk about weapons of mass destruction. But with 3 mentions in the revision. Though mentions of the Black Panthers went slightly down from 23 to 18, mention of Malcolm X went up by 2 to 18. Reparations went down to 1 from 15, and systemic went from 9 to 0. Predictably, and consistent with what Cornel West called the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King Jr., mentions of MLK nearly doubled in the revision from 9 to 17. Now, when I look at these data, the thing that stands out the most obviously to me is the demonization of intersectionality and Black feminist thought, as well as of specific Black women and their political organizing, as a primary target of conservative attacks. And yet the headline in the Post was, "Did politics scrub systemic from AP African American Studies plan?" Now, sure, intersectionality and systemic are overlapping concepts. Can't really have intersectionality as a concept without an understanding of inequality as systemic. But that Kimberly Crenshaw is more threatening to conservative whites than Malcolm X and the Black Panthers is telling. I do not mean to suggest that Rufo, DeSantis, and their colleagues understand intersectionality theory or are even intellectually purposeful when they attack intersectionality more vociferously than they attack other concepts. But their attention to intersectionality is meaningful data in the quest to better understand the work they're doing here, which draws upon white supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia, and transphobia to incite structural, intersectional violence. The evidence is apparent beyond DeSantis's antics in Florida. In April, the American Libraries Association released its list of the top 10 most challenged books in the US. These are the books that activist groups such as the Moms for Liberty asked to be removed from schools and public libraries, as well as from curricula and reading lists. As Rufo and his colleagues have moved somewhat from anti-CRT to anti-LGBT activism over the past 2 years, the media frame has predictably suggested that new targets have been identified. Again, a single-axis lens is used to frame the anti-CRT crusades as about race and nothing else, whereas the anti-LGBT frenzy is about sexuality and gender, but not about race. However, all the books on this top 10 list are challenged because of sexual content, regardless of whether or not the content is LGBT related, and at least 4 are written by queer and trans people of color. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison is the 6th most challenged book, according to the ALA, for, quote, rape, incest, claimed to be sexually explicit, comma, EDI content, whatever that last part means. Book challenges are pervasive, and while highest in Florida and Texas, data from the ALA indicate that geography does not dictate where the currents of censorship flow. A total of 4,240 unique book titles were challenged in 2023, up from 2022's previous record of 2,571. Montana, New York, and West Virginia had among the lowest rates of attempted book retentions, revocations, and restrictions, whereas Idaho, Wisconsin, Colorado, and Virginia ranked among the highest. Imagine liberal bastions of the mid-Atlantic, such as my home state of Maryland and Pennsylvania, both recorded high rates of censorship, as did California. Consistently, books by Black women and queer people of color rank among the top titles attacked by conservatives, despite these groups' relative size compared to all published authors. To reduce the issue of censorship campaigns to a single axis of race or sexuality or gender is to actively neglect the intersectional nature of fascist politics in the US. Education is, of course, not the only site in which single axis frames, even on the left, continue to obscure intersectional dynamics. Many of us were together in Puerto Rico at the 2022 SPSSI conference when the landmark Dobbs decision reversed decades of legal precedent guaranteeing the ever-shrinking right to safe and legal abortion. When talking about the consequences of abortion bans and severe restrictions, now enacted by a majority of US states, according to the Guttmacher Institute, it is arguably more common to now hear explanations that include the disproportionate effects of these laws on poor and working class women and communities of color, as well as to hear the gender-inclusive language of pregnancy-capable people. Such shifting rhetoric and understanding, due largely to decades of reproductive justice activism led by women of color, expand our understanding of reproductive oppression beyond the single-axis frames that privilege white, cisgender, middle-class women's right to privacy and choice, as astutely put by some of the stewards of reproductive justice in psychology, including Alyssa Zucker, Asia Eaton, and Deion Stevens. However, simply acknowledging the heterogeneous impacts of abortion bans across the population only recognizes the downstream effects of racist, misogynist, and theocratic policies, as opposed to investigating their upstream causes and ideological motivators. Feminist psychologist and SPSSI keynote speaker, Dr. Sarah McClelland, will speak much more about this tomorrow, and you should not miss it. But I think it's important to note here that her recent work with Majel Baker and Kristen Joskowski has explored how racist and sexist attitudes predict attitudes toward abortion above and beyond religiosity and when controlling for political ideology. They've replicated their findings in both convenience and population-level samples, suggesting that intersecting exclusionary attitudes undergird or are at least co-constitutive of abortion attitudes at the level of ideology. Attacks on transgender people in healthcare, particularly transgender-affirming care, similarly foreground the issue of gender identity and diversity at the expense of intersectionality, despite the undeniable evidence that hatred directed at transgender people is deeply intersectional in terms of ideology and impact. Hatch and colleagues' 2022 meta-analysis of 82 studies of transgender prejudice found that individual difference variables, including heterosexism, social dominance orientation, and right-wing authoritarianism, were significant predictors of anti-trans prejudice, with attitudes towards LGB people demonstrating the greatest magnitude, R equals 0.71. But because so little research in psychology has explored how racial attitudes interact with transgender prejudice, Hatch and colleagues reported no evidence of the relation between racism and cissexism. Meanwhile, extensive quantitative evidence, work by Jacqueline Hutto, Russ Toomey, Jessica Fish, and qualitative research, such as the work of Kirsten Gonzalez, Paz Galupo, Roberto Abreu, Abby Goldberg, and many more, has documented the health inequities among transgender and non-binary people that consistently reflect worse mental and physical health outcomes for trans people of color, especially Black and Latinx trans people. Qualitative work, in particular, indicates that trans people of color attribute these outcomes to the intersectional and compounded effects of structural racism, xenophobia, and structural cis-heteropatriarchy on their experiences across registers of social life, including in healthcare, education, and work. Moreover, transgender studies scholars, most of whom do not work in psychology departments or publish in psychology journals, have used historical and cultural methods to explain the racist and colonialist roots of anti-transgender ideology in the US, which yoke transgression of white cis-hetero social norms to Blackness and racial otherness, as well as disability. Building on Moya Bailey's transformative work, trans-misogynoir has emerged as a potent analytic for thinking through the apparent contradiction that while Black and Latinx trans women have been at the forefront of various LGBT movements for sexual and gender liberation, they are the very most vulnerable to violence among all LGBT people. Historian and transgender studies scholar Jules Gill Peterson recently reflected that the child, as an idea, a signifier of innocence and vulnerability, is a central figure in coordinated and mutually reinforcing movements and their attendant laws and policies to deny the freedom and dignity of pregnancy-capable and transgender people. That the left's attempts to normalize transgender-affirming treatment and abortion procedures as just healthcare have been largely unsuccessful at deterring their opponents is unsurprising, according to Gill Peterson, because the anti-abortion and anti-transgender coalition has embraced an intersectional politics that weave together gender, sexuality, race, and age to attack those who threaten the heterosexual reproductive capacities of white people, denying the nation the white babies it needs to counter the multicultural, multiracial, and increasingly non-procreative left. I would also add to Gill Peterson's critique that from the vantage of fascist paranoia, the child is also imperiled in the library and at school, where they might learn lessons from Black women and other women of color, as well as any trans and queer people of color, to dream, as Asian Americanist Candace Chu famously put it, otherwise. So one last time, let's return to Florida, where DEI staff were summarily fired in March due to a new ban on such positions signed by DeSantis, whom I will try but can't promise not to mention again tonight. Fascist laws targeting virtually all marginalized groups in education, both staff roles and educational content, have an acutely intersectional flavor. Recall that due to pressure from Florida politicians, the College Board evacuated intersectionality, Black feminism, and womanism from its AP African American Studies curriculum in 2023. Again, I am not suggesting that Christopher Rufo, DeSantis, and company know anything about intersectionality in an academic sense of knowledge, but I think it makes good sense that they came for intersectionality. Feminist psychologists Nicola Curtin and past SPSSI presidents Abby Stewart and Liz Cole have empirically documented how awareness of intersectionality as a political orientation is associated with pro-social attitudes toward outgroup members, as well as at least the intention to be socially engaged. Based on Greenwood's earlier work on feminist political attitudes and action, as well as that of Stewart's and Lauren Duncan, they developed a unidimensional 8-item scale of intersectional awareness, or understanding of structural inequality from an intersectional perspective. Of particular note is their observation that intersectional awareness exhibited a moderate, positive, significant correlation with rights-based activism, and moderate to strong negative correlations with constructs including social dominance orientation and system justification, patterns that replicated and only strengthened when examined across samples. Akin to critical consciousness as operationalized by Deemer and Shin and colleagues, as well as anti-neoliberal attitudes as measured by Lena Bei Chang, Alyssa Zucker, myself, and others, Curtin and colleagues' work provides empirical support for the notion that learning about and internalizing key concepts of intersectionality may in fact result in a population less inclined to authoritarianism and actively hostile to fascist programs and policies, including censorship, segregation, and the denial of civil rights. In sum, awareness of intersectionality and a structural, integrative understanding of oppression and resistance is far more dangerous to fascism than single-axis and non-intersectional understandings of power. So while any concepts from critical race theory, feminism, and queer theory may be threatening to Rufo and his allies, it seems that intersectionality may be the scariest of them all. At this point, I've reviewed some of the evidence from recent political and historical events to build the case that it's worth thinking about fascism as an intersectional project, even as it may make many of us deeply uncomfortable to link these two concepts together. After all, one of the fascinating developments of intersectionality's travels across academia over the past 30 years has been the rhetorical transformation of the term into a positive signifier, despite its original use as a metaphor to describe a site of structural violence. In psychology and other fields that have incorporated intersectionality somewhat, it is not uncommon to hear phrases like, "You need to take a more intersectional approach," or "Your analysis is not intersectional enough." Intersectional feminist has become a common qualifier for feminists who embrace intersectionality, and many of us in this room have made the case that psychology should become more intersectional. But that is qualitatively distinct from Crenshaw's earliest uses of the term to delineate three kinds of structural violence, which she called structural, representational, and political intersectionality. In that rhetorical frame, it would be far more accurate to say that intersectionality as a noun possessed a negative valence, and that the goal of studying intersectionality was the elimination of intersectionality through analyses and political organizing that took an integrative approach to considering the interlocking nature of race, gender, and other systems of oppression. That's part of why Patricia Hill Collins provocatively claimed that Nazis were intersectional in her recent work, including her treatise on structural violence, Lethal Intersections, published just last year. From her position as a founding theorist of intersectionality, Collins uses Black feminism to postulate intersectionality as driven by 6 core constructs: relationality, power, social inequality, social context, complexity, and social justice. These are supplemented by 4 guiding premises. The first is that race, class, gender, and similar systems of power are interdependent and co-constructive. Second, that intersecting power relations produce complex and interdependent systems of inequality. Third, that individuals' social locations within intersecting systems of power relations shape their experiences and worldviews. And fourth, that solving social problems from the local to the global requires an intersectional approach. In the final chapter of Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, Collins suggests it's productive to consider whether the 6th core construct of intersectionality, social justice, is actually an inherent or essential component, or rather assumed to be by its proponents, including me. Quote, "Placing intersectionality in dialogue with eugenics, a discourse that is not committed to social justice," Collins writes, "illuminates the significance of ethical criteria within intersectionality as a critical social theory," end quote. With the exception of social justice, Collins demonstrates how eugenics movements, which began to proliferate in the 1920s across the West, South America, and the Soviet Union, but climaxed with the Nazi regime throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, possessed the other 5 core constructs of intersectionality. She argues that eugenicists had a keen sense of how state and other forms of institutional and disciplinary power could be used to address social inequality. She continues, "Race or ethnicity, or ability, or similar categories of analysis were not its main object of investigation. Rather, eugenics drew upon these categories of analysis within a relational framework that was implicitly intersectional. In essence, eugenics was a coded discourse about ability, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and nation that, by bundling these ideas together from these distinctive categories, had an effect that was broader than any one strand of its analysis. Eugenics was not an intentionally intersectional project, but rather a project whose overarching goals relied on relational thinking that resembles intersectionality's own." Of course, Collins is not arguing that American or Nazi eugenics proponents were precursors to the rise of third-wave feminism, or that there is any direct intellectual or historical linkage between eugenics and Black feminist thought. But she is compelling us to consider disquieting similarities between eugenics and intersectionality so that we might recognize how profoundly dangerous intersectional logics can be when divorced from social justice. She argues that A, eugenicists demonstrated the power of relational logic to produce and legitimate structural violence. B, that eugenics were a saturated site of intersecting power relations. C, that eugenics illustrated the malleability of vectors of power, such as race, gender, sexuality, and age across social contexts, whereby the categories became differentially salient depending on the setting, aims, and project. And finally, D, that all social theories have political outcomes, whether or not they claim to be political. Because of course, much of eugenics discourse was allegedly scientific and not tied to nationality, nationalism, and the nation state, except that it always was. Now, lest we think the lesson here is only about hindsight, Collins draws upon feminist and anti-racist science studies scholars such as Troy Duster to underscore how critical theories in the wake of eugenics have exposed that while the term itself fell out of favor by the 1950s, eugenics by another name proliferate today in, for example, post-genomic research that reproduces biological race realism through big data and advanced statistics about the distribution of desirable and undesirable traits across the human population, and in carceral and healthcare policies that promote what Winters and McLaughlin called the soft sterilization of low-income criminalized women through allegedly empowering contraceptive devices, such as the IUD. Writing in the prior decade, Collins may not have anticipated that the far right would embrace biological essentialism as the key argument, buttressed by cherry-picked and deeply activist science, to argue not only the illegitimacy of and immorality of transgender-affirming healthcare, but even against the existence of transgender people. This is perhaps best encapsulated by the deeply uninnocent question, what is a woman? Which was paraphrased and weaponized against Black women, trans people, and their allies throughout 2022. Recall that this is what Senator Marsha Blackburn used to try to discredit Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson during her March 22 nomination hearing, suggesting her unwillingness to answer the question indicated her unsuitability for the role of Associate Justice of the Court. Senator Josh Hawley used a similar line of questioning in his attempt to embarrass renowned anthropologist and legal scholar Kiara Bridges during her testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee about the fallout of the Dobbs decision, not about transgender rights or healthcare. But he was activated by her use of gender-inclusive language to describe people who would be affected by abortion bans sweeping the country. In both cases, these Black women's use of non-essentialist language and logic from their positions of epistemic authority threaten the biological essentialism that has become the social theory of the right. Social categories are natural, clear, binary, and immutable. Note also that Cole and colleagues systematically documented the deployment of essentialist arguments about the naturalness of marriage in news coverage of same-sex marriage controversies in the pre-Obergefell 21st century, finding that, quote, the rhetoric of the natural forcefully pushes back against these incursions by using apparently simple arguments that tap deep-seated psychological mechanisms of essentialism. I use the term uninnocent purposefully. Groundbreaking new work in feminist philosophy by Elena Ruiz foregrounds the role of impunity in the production and maintenance of settler colonialism and white supremacy. Ruiz observes that much of the talk of systemic inequality is often attributed to the disembodied system. No one knows where it comes from, what makes it tick, or who's responsible for it, though there's a tacit assumption that responsibility, if any, is diffuse and elusive. In psychology, Liz Cole and I called this the no-fault racism produced by so much implicit bias research that attributes prejudicial attitudes to non-conscious and irresistible socialization into racist systems. It seems that the word systemic, the one the College Board scrubbed from the AP African American Studies curriculum, ironically does a lot of work in contemporary social, political, and scientific discourse, actually eliminating guilt and blame for the systems that produce such violence. And yet Christopher Rufo, the Moms for Liberty, and others object to critical race theory in part because it allegedly is designed to make white children feel guilty for a system of which they have no ownership and for which they possess no responsibility. Impunity, according to Ruiz, quote, is the structurally supported exercise of power without accountability, end quote. And yet structural violence, Rees asserts, is never accidental. Following Collins, I'd like to supplement her analysis of the intersectional dimensions of fascism to suggest that these far-right social movements also deploy another cornerstone of intersectionality to advance their structural violence: coalitions, or functional, purposeful relationships among diverse social actors in coordination to achieve political aims. Black and multiracial feminist scholarship has emphasized the role of coalitions in intersectional activism, pointing to how movement organizing around shared commitments to combating injustice is a key element of how diverse groups of women and allies come together in justice work, even as they recognize how social identities differentially position groups in relation to systems of power and privilege. In a landmark 2008 paper, drawing upon qualitative interviews with women as part of the Global Feminisms Project, which we learned so much about last year from Abby Stewart's beautiful presidential address, Liz Cole suggested that coalitions were an analytically potent alternative to identity for psychologists and other empirical social scientists interested in pursuing intersectionality research. Whereas the relatively limiting concept of social identity has the tendency to orient psychological analyses toward perceived group differences and reductionist framings of identity as oppression or privilege, coalitions emphasize similarities and differences among group members simultaneously, complexly, and sometimes in tension. Coalitions do not mandate that group members be identical, be the same in order to work together. But as Akia Luna's definitive study of the reproductive justice movement shows us, effective coalitions necessitate that members iteratively consider their relationships to power and injustice. Learning from coalitions, Cole calls on psychologists to use intersectionality, quote, to understand race and gender as social processes, and to find and make use of similarities arising from these social and historical processes that cut across identity groups. Again, a la Collins, if we consider that social justice may not always be the ethical goal of coalition work, we can see how contemporary fascist movements, such as Project 2025, engage in forging coalitions to enact structural violence. In identifying Christian cis heteropatriarchy as the intersectional political objective, Project 2025 unites movement workers across the far right in what I am calling a coalition of violence. The Project 2025 Manifesto, a playbook for a new conservative presidency, speaks directly to the diverse interests of anti-trans, anti-abortion, anti-gay, anti-black, anti-immigrant, and hyper-nationalist groups to shepherd an anti-democratic, white, Christian, theocratic social order. And that is my definition of fascism for you. I have traced the way movements across the right have collaborated in the production of policies that would entrench structural violence across a range of social issues that on the surface may appear to be unconnected. But coalitions of violence are effective at identifying similarities, such as allegiance to white supremacy and patriarchy, that transcend different relationships to administrative violence, such as abortion restrictions. White men and white women on the right may not experience abortion restrictions in the same way, but they coalesce around anti-abortion politics because of a shared orientation to and investment in power. I'm not suggesting that this is a new 21st century phenomenon, but it is one that often goes unnamed or mischaracterized by vague constructs such as faith or law and order. In the 1990s, critical race theorist Sumi Cho studied the paradox of white women's hostility toward affirmative action programs, despite white women constituting the demographic group that most benefited from such programs in the United States. She found that the against their own interests logic, first popularized by Du Bois to describe the alliance of working class whites with land-owning capitalists during the Reconstruction period, obscures the ways that opposing affirmative action was indeed consistent with these white women's interests. That is, if you examine the issue from an intersectional perspective. Many white women told journalists throughout the anti-affirmative action campaigns in Washington State and California during the 90s that they saw affirmative action as threatening the economic well-being of their sons, brothers, husbands, fathers, and to quote Gigi Awad earlier today, my cousin, these hypothetical white men throughout their social networks. It was squarely in their interest to ensure that white men maintain their social advantage. because it meant the maintenance of unearned and unfair advantages, that is, wealth and status accumulation, endemic to the culture of white supremacy, expressed in the rhetoric of love, the impunity of theft. This is the 1992 paper that popularized the fallacious, non-scientific concept of post-abortion syndrome, which continues to be used by anti-abortion activists as evidence that abortion hurts the mental health of people who have the procedure, despite a preponderance of scientific evidence to the contrary. Does anyone in the audience, besides Lisa Rosenthal, who tipped me off to this paper, know where this article was published? The Journal of Social Issues, the flagship journal of SPSSI. In a fabulous new paper by Huberman and Ozaguz, the authors chart the politicized creation of post-abortion syndrome in the pages of JSI and its proliferation throughout legal, medical, and popular discourse. They refer to the social actors who created PAS as engaging in willful distortion of psychological evidence that produced profound and pervasive ignorance about the psychology of abortion. Decades of harm, generations of structural violence. It would be willfully ignorant and outright delusional for us to tell ourselves that psychologists, even good psychologists like us, do not possess the power and capacity to advance profoundly harmful ideology and anti-science in the pages of our academic journals and in the halls of our conferences, lending our epistemic authority to the ministers of structural violence. The history of psychology has shown that we are quite capable of joining coalitions of violence or resisting them. I want to conclude somewhat hopefully, because there is much in the discipline today that feels fundamentally different and better than it did when I first encountered it over 20 years ago. But I remain deeply concerned about how psychology is supposed to produce social justice when we, as a discipline, remain so deeply skeptical and resistant to the tools that we've had for decades that may be best suited to disarm the weapons of mass death that are coming for us as we speak. Black feminist and women of color psychologists have been writing for at least 50 years in the pages of journals, including JSI, about the necessity of integrative approaches to understanding inequality that account for the overlapping nature of oppression and privilege and the unique forms of harm produced by these systems. Althea Smith and Abby Stewart co-edited a special issue of JSI in 1983 on the integrative model for studying race and gender that reads like the blueprint for Crenshaw's papers in the early 90s. And yet a deep or cursory glance at the state of intersectionality in psychology suggests a continued resistance across the discipline to actually engage theories of intersectionality on their own terms, rather than on strictly psychological terms. First, there's the perennial methods fixation, where psychologists, including me, go back and forth about how best to do intersectionality in science. Here, the problem of intersectionality becomes a problem of testing, design, and measurement, well tread in dozens of some of the most highly cited papers in all of intersectionality studies, including work by Lisa Boleg and Leah Warner, that's tried to pull us out of the trapdoor of methods and back into doing the work. Then there's the identities fixation, where psychologists, including me, tell other psychologists that they're missing the point by focusing on identity as the primary unit of intersectional inquiry, rather than the systems of inequality that make those identities so consequential. Bonnie Moratti, Aida Hurtado, and many others have been repeating this point for a few decades now. But despite attempts to unmoor intersectionality from the grip of identity-focused analyses, there is perhaps no more common invocation in all of intersectionality research in psychology than the phrase, intersecting identities, which in and of itself tells us nothing more than that people are more than one thing at the same time. Moratti and colleagues' citation analysis of intersectionality research suggests that people outside of psychology really trust what psychologists have to say about it, or at least they cite it. Psychology is the second largest cluster of citations on intersectionality among the 17,000 academic articles they studied. You might think that with all these special issues and talk about intersectionality in psychology, we'd see an abundance of papers representing what Dylan Coleman called strong intersectionality, a focus on structure, power, and the relationships among systems of oppression. But there's some indication that psychologists have been more inclined to practice what Dylan Coleman called weak intersectionality, which takes identities for granted and fails to think relationally. For example, in a systematic review of all intersectionality papers published in Journal of Counseling Psychology and The Counseling Psychologist through 2016, Richard Shin and his colleagues found that the majority represented weak intersectionality, only 8 represented strong intersectionality, and only 4 took an expressly transformative approach, encouraging psychologists to harness their tools for social justice action. In other words, many of them used intersectionality, but their relationship to social justice was ambiguous. Using their framework of epistemic exclusion, Isis Settles, Leah Warner, Nicole Buchanan, and Marty Jones investigated how intersectionality may be subject to both disciplinary biases in psychology that privilege certain kinds of research questions, as well as biases toward marginalized group members, including authors and the communities they study. Despite observing an enormous uptick in intersectionality articles published in PsycInfo between 2004, when there were 7, and 2019, when there were 562, only less than 0.5% of intersectionality articles were published in the 10 psychology journals with the highest impact factors. Consistent with Roberts and colleagues' findings on racism in psychological publishing, Settles and colleagues conclude that intersectionality still threatens core positivist principles that remain central to psychology, and that these challenges, in terms of method, epistemology, population, and politics, remain subject to pervasive epistemic exclusion. When it is included, they observe a dilution and misrepresentation of intersectionality that constitutes another form of epistemic harm. Liz Cole and I observed similar dynamics in recent high-profile psychological research on American racism, leading us to assert that intersectionality is not a footnote. It should be the framework. It may seem odd for any of us in this room to say that we study fascism. We're taught to be good psychologists who study constructs, who test falsifiable theory. We're not historians, not even sociologists. But many of us who live in the big tent of SPSSI study social justice, and social theorists across the disciplines increasingly point to contemporary fascist movements as the greatest threat to social justice since the Second World War. And they also insist that contemporary or late fascism is deeply identitarian and adept at harnessing identity to be repackaged in an arsenal of hate directed back at marginalized peoples and social movements. As I've attempted to show, the fascists are not afraid to use the tools of intersectionality, divorced from social justice, to realize their goals. Unfortunately, much of psychology still appears to be, but not all of it. Writing in Current Opinion in Psychology, Lisa Boleg and colleagues found that a collection of 22 articles using intersectionality to explore sexual and gender diversity, published in only the first 6 months of 2022, did exemplary work representing the theory and thinking about the role of structure in unequal health outcomes for LGBT plus people. And there are people like Rebecca Covarrubias, who's training a new generation of scholars to understanding structures of inequality in higher education from an intersectional perspective, and producing a body of scholarship that is theoretically incisive and pointedly transformational in aims. Jennifer Gomez is threading the needle through clinical psychology, trauma theory, and Black feminism to develop cultural betrayal trauma theory, foregrounding the intra-group harm that happens when Black women and girls experience sexual abuse perpetrated by racial in-group members. And in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, a group of mostly junior SPSSI scholars, some of whom are here tonight, joined me in creating a special issue of Translational Issues in Psychological Science devoted to using intersectionality for transformative scholarship in domains such as sexual harassment, biracial identity, media studies, and gendered racial microaggressions, an area of study pioneered by counseling psychologist Gioni Lewis. Jill Fish is transforming Indigenous studies in psychology through critical intersectional participatory action research. And people such as Candice Hargans, Sari Van Anders, and Lenice Avery and their students are igniting sexuality studies through intersectional critique. New thought leaders are rising up and resisting the epistemic riptide that pulls psychologists away from structural inquiry and back toward a reductionist understanding of the individual. Anecdotally, I think our students and junior colleagues are far less afraid of intersectionality than many of our professors were, and I hope that they're ultimately less punished and excluded by mainstream psychology than so many of intersectionality's earliest proponents were. Alberto Toscano writes in his new book on fascism that, quote, domination is not homogeneously experienced because it is not homogeneously exercised. It is on this background, too, that we may work politically to re-articulate our connections. This is both obvious and profound. We have the tools at our disposal. We don't need another best practices paper, another special issue, or another symposium debating the promises and pitfalls of intersectionality. I think we need to re-articulate our connections, meet the moment, and do brave work together. Thank you. We've got 2 minutes before booze, right, Les?
Far be it from us to stand in between you and booze, but do we have time for one question? Any takers?
It's been real hot and we all make I will not be. Omar. Don't make this one too tough. I'm tired.
I was here last year. There was a keynote speech as well, and I think generally there's a tendency in American psychology to have a sort of a liberal celebration of modernism and so on. And what I'm saying is that while I agree with your analysis about American fascism as what has been unfolding since the past 8 months, my question is that how do we understand liberal complicity in fascism? Because what enables fascism, as they say, you scratch a liberal, a fascist bleeds. Mm-hmm. It's like it takes a 9/11, it takes an October 7th for a person like Jonathan Haidt to come around and put an American flag on his truck to tell everyone that he loves America.
Well put. That quote was what I had on the board before we began our session tonight. I could have spoken only about anti-fascist theory tonight. That wasn't what I wanted to do, but it's something that I've been deep in over the past couple of months, learning a lot. It's not something that I went to graduate school to study, and it's not something that really I've been focusing on much since even the rise of Donald Trump's political. In that rhetorical frame, it would be far more accurate to say that intersectionality as a noun possessed a negative valence, and that the goal of studying intersectionality was the elimination of intersectionality through analyses and political organizing that took an integrative approach to considering the interlocking nature of race, gender, and other systems of oppression. That's part of why Patricia Hill Collins provocatively claimed that Nazis were intersectional in her recent work, including her treatise on structural violence, Lethal Intersections, published just last year. From her position as a founding theorist of intersectionality, Collins uses Black feminism to postulate intersectionality as driven by 6 core constructs: relationality, power, social inequality, social context, complexity, and social justice. These are supplemented by 4 guiding premises. The first is that race, class, gender, and similar systems of power are interdependent and co-constructive. Second, that intersecting power relations produce complex and interdependent systems of inequality. Third, that individuals' social locations within intersecting systems of power relations shape their experiences and worldviews. And fourth, that solving social problems from the local to the global requires an intersectional approach. In the final chapter of Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, Collins suggests it's productive to consider whether the 6th core construct of intersectionality, social justice, is actually an inherent or essential component, or rather assumed to be by its proponents, including me. Quote, Placing intersectionality in dialogue with eugenics, a discourse that is not committed to social justice, Collins writes, illuminates the significance of ethical criteria within intersectionality as a critical social theory, end quote. With the exception of social justice, Collins demonstrates how eugenics movements, which began to proliferate in the 1920s across the West, South America, and the Soviet Union, but